The Stanley Parable is a game that appears to give you a large amount of freedom. As you listen to its disembodied narrator, you are constantly confronted with choices, mostly whether or not to follow his intended path that he dictates to you at every turn. However, no matter how much free will you as the player exercise over the game's mechanics, once you reach the end of a run, one thing consistently remains the same. The game will fade to black, placing you right back where you started in room 427. This allows you to try out as many of these combinations of choices as you want, finding new ways to interact with the narrator and with your environment. But the degree to which you disobey the narrator never changes the fact that you'll always begin again on the other side in room 427. This office marks the beginning and end of every run, a respawn point as it would be called in other games. Stanley Parable is different though, as each of its runs aren't defined by the constant threat of mortality or death, but by the eventual climax of a built-in, ever-changing narrative, one that's ambiguous and determined by continuous player interaction. It uses the mechanic of death and the hard resetting of player characters to ludicrously express its themes and existential messaging, making us wonder of the true nature of Stanley, of the narrator, and of the game itself. The ending that expresses this the best is called the Mariella ending. To get this ending, Stanley must first follow the narrator, going through the left door as instructed, and making his way to the meeting room. However, when confronted with a stairwell up to the boss's office, Stanley goes down instead, and finds himself in this eternally looping set of rooms. Once you pass through the same 3 or 4 rooms repeatedly, the narrator's dictation gets more and more intense, describing Stanley's thoughts as he descends further into insanity.
For example, why couldn't he see his feet when he looked down? Why did doors close automatically behind him wherever he went? And for that matter, these rooms were starting to look pretty familiar. Were they simply repeating? No, Stanley said to himself, this is all too strange. This can't be real.
The narrator then draws attention to himself, as Stanley notices for the first time that distinct guiding voice in his head. All of this being relayed to us as we view from the perspective of the player.
Why is there a voice in my head dictating everything that I'm doing and thinking? Now the voice was describing itself being considered by Stanley, who found it particularly strange.
For the first time, Stanley is not you. He's a separate entity, frantically convincing himself he's real and that he just needs to wake up and everything will be okay. The ending finishes with the introduction of a character named Mariella, who happens across Stanley stumbling around like a crazy person before falling over dead. Within minutes, we go from assuming the role of Stanley to observing Stanley gaining self-awareness of the narrative he's trapped in as a character of the game, to then escaping the context of Stanley Parable itself, seeing the events of the game through an entirely different perspective. By challenging the player's expectations of consequence and finality, the game raises existential questions of what it means to die at all, to die in video games, and thoughts about our own mortality. We are presented with a character's perspective so removed from Stanley's experiences so far and from everything we know about the game, that we are then forced to consider the game's inconsistencies, its themes, and Stanley's ultimate fate. There are other endings of the game that express this, like the Not Stanley ending or the Museum ending, both of which take the player beyond the fourth wall, exposing design elements carried over from the perspective of the developers. But the Mariella ending stands out to me because it breaks apart from these mechanical and ludic aspects, focusing only on the story, exploring the limits of the narrative and broader ideas of consciousness. Death in video games is typically a very guiding mechanic, something the player is always conscious to avoid, such as in the form of keeping tabs on their health bar. The fun happens when you don't die, or when you die enough so that you've memorized exactly how not to get hit. A great example of this is Dark Souls or Hollow Knight, games that elaborate on this mechanic, making you go visit your spot of death to reclaim your humanity or in-game currency. Though many games rely on their death mechanics to direct or inspire the player, death remains consistently something to be avoided. In Stanley Parable, though, the mechanic of death serves an entirely different purpose, as a catalyst for narrative progression and for the introduction of broader themes. Thank you for listening.